not crazy about this translation online. The wonderful thing about the Iliad and the Odyssey is you can actually buy them on used bookstores online for like 99 cents. And there's some good translations. This translation I'm going to put up online. Those of you that don't want to buy the book can read book 15. But that's what it's named after, which is kind of strange in itself, isn't it? You got the planet of war, the god of war, Mars, which goes back to Roman tradition, I believe. And you've got Ares, you know, this whole entire reference to war, Deimos, Phobos, mysterious little moonlets, little planets. I think it's, what is it? It's 11 kilometers. It's 11 kilometers. And Phobos, of course, is 7 times as large as Deimos. It is a fascinating thing. It's all fascinating stuff. 40%. It has basically a hollowed out cavity inside on some level, and of course it's leaking. It's leaking something. Which, of course, if something was pressurized, that's what it would mean. Something's pressurized inside on some level. Very strange stuff. It's a legitimate Western mystery that is shaping up. Where are they going with this Mars thing? Where's the ESA going with it? Well, they're calling attention to something Richard Hoagland has said, which is rather interesting in itself, because that's not something I would do unless he was right on something and I wanted the world to know about it. The ESA cannot come out and say anything like that. They've already said enough crazy stuff about Phobos and Deimos. But it is interesting. The orbit itself, which I can't, is fascinating. How they show up all of a sudden is fascinating. No one can really explain any of the stuff. How they were named. And it is quite a story behind the naming. I won't go into the whole entire thing because I don't quite understand all the different machinations involved. But that is something Richard Hoagland does do quite well. I'll give him credit for. He knows all about the naming of the planets and how they were named and the different controversies involved in the naming. Because all the planets are named after something in Western civilization, if you haven't noticed. But that's a legitimate mystery, and we're going to go on with a modern mystery. I'm going to talk about the moon. I'm going to talk about some what you see is what you get mysteries regarding the moon, and update something I talked about before about NASA firing a missile into the moon. We're going to talk about that in the next episode. But Phobos and Deimos, keep your eyes on the information regarding Phobos and Deimos. I don't know where they're going with this one, but someone's going somewhere. This podcast is always done real time, so sometimes I talk about events that people want me to talk about again, or updates on things. I've talked about, during a podcast long ago, I talked about when NASA was firing a missile into the moon to see if there was water. And I was asked about the whole story behind it and what's going on with the moon. And if you know anything about alternative news and research, they make their money off legitimate myths and mysteries. I've already talked briefly about Phobos and Deimos, and no one can really explain it. It's a legitimate Western mystery, or global mystery, or solar system-wide mystery, whatever you want to say about it. But it's by and large Western, in my opinion. And this stuff with the moon has also become somewhat mysterious on what happened afterwards and the whole thing leading into it. But we'll go into that, and I have to go back in time to 1994 and talk about the events that preceded NASA firing a missile into the south side of the moon. There's a great deal of mystery regarding the moon, and of course we've talked about, in the previous podcast I touched on a movie, Iron Sky, that deals with the Nazi moon base, and it is a competing mythos now. Start talking about moon bases and alien moon bases and Nazi moon bases. It is a total competing mythos for another mythos. And that is Roswell, or an extension of that mythos. And we've talked about this in a variety of different ways, and you would have to listen to the previous podcast to get my whole entire view on that. But when it comes to the moon, there are some legitimate questions, some legitimate mysteries, legitimate questions that no one is answering. No one's coming forward to answer. And we're going to talk about where this all began, where these questions began. And these are legitimate facts. Back in 1994, the Naval Research Laboratory was a major contractor to a particular spacecraft. And the spacecraft was the Deep Space Program Science Experiment, DSPSE. This was in 1994. It was launched on January 25th, 1994. And it was a joint project that got some attention. It was between NASA and BMDO, what you think of as Ballistic Missile Defense Organization. And basically it was called, there's a code word for it, there's a short word for it, it's called Clementine. It was basically a satellite that was going up to map the moon. And we're not talking about just map the moon, because they had already mapped the moon. That's where the questions came in. They already mapped the moon. They had extensive maps of the moon. NASA had all kinds of extensive maps of the moon. But the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization and the Naval Research Laboratory wanted serious maps of the moon. How serious? Well, let's go over it. It had a UV visible camera, a near-infrared camera, a long wavelength infrared camera, a high-resolution camera, 2 star tracker cameras, a laser altimeter, and a charged particle telescope. An S-band transponder was used for communications, tracking, and gravimetry experiment. And the project was named Clementine after the song "Oh My Darling Clementine," obviously. And it was kind of a head scratcher on why they were doing all this. And the charged particle telescope was there to measure the flux of spectra of energetic protons and electrons. The ultraviolet visible camera was most interesting. They were studying the moon and 1620 geographos at 5 different wavelengths in the ultraviolet spectrum. They were looking at another spectrum that we cannot see, ultraviolet. We can't see ultraviolet light. Yes, all you white rabbits have been sunburned because ultraviolet light means something, but we can't see it. There's a lot of things in this universe we can't see. We don't see light. We see light reflecting off things, and we can't see certain spectrums like ultraviolet. But they were looking at it. There was also a near-infrared CCD camera, and that was the study of the moon and this N1620 geographos at 6 different wavelengths in the near-infrared spectrum. So they were looking at another spectrum. They were looking at all these different spectrums. Kind of wild stuff. High-resolution camera, they were studying certain portions of the moon, namely the south side of the moon. They were studying this big, I guess it was ice cap, and there are pictures of it. You can actually see the Clementine lunar map, and I will put a lot of this up on my Twitter for you. You can read about it. But it was a head-scratcher on why the hell would the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization want to study the moon? It had already been mapped. Why all this extensive mapping, and why all this ultraviolet camera, all this ultraviolet pictures, which of course we can't see. We can see one of the Clementine Lunar Map 2.0, the extensive mapping they did, but I can't really make up anything of it. It just looks like the moon. But all this other stuff they were doing, all these experiments, and this went on, I'm guessing, till around 96 or whenever it came back, and nothing really was made of it. Nothing really was made of it until I was actually making this podcast, and it would have been actually, I guess, in late 2009. L-Cross was launched on June 18, 2009. So sometime in the fall, they were talking about this L-Cross, and I'm going to go over L-Cross with you. Then we'll tie it in together. But basically, the basic overview was the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization got together with NASA, and they launched a satellite to map the moon. And we're not talking about map the moon. They were mapping the moon in other spectrums. They were doing all kinds of different experiments, looking for something, or why the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization were going to do that. Why were they interested in this? Well, it's quite common sense now. In hindsight vision is always 20/20. It lends itself to the truth. And we got to talk about L-Cross. L-Cross happened real time. Why this podcast was coming out, and it was something that we haven't pondered until they fired a missile. L-Cross was going back to the moon, and it got some attention. It got some attention because what do you get when you cross 4 L's? Well, if you cross 4 L's, you get a swastika. Well, it got some attention by its name alone. Its name alone was a head scratcher. So you have this mission L-Cross going into to fire something in the south side of the moon to see their water. Well, there's a polar ice cap there, and they already knew there was water there. They knew there was water there long before. They know there's water on the moon. So you have an experiment to see if there's a water on the moon, and they're seeing the water. They're going to see if there's water on the moon by firing a massive projectile into the south side of the moon, the South Pole. And this becomes somewhat of a head scratcher on why they were doing this, why they were firing an actual missile, a projectile, a missile into the South Pole of the moon to see if there's water, which they already know about. Well, it goes back to the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization in Clementine. They were studying the South Pole of the moon. They were studying the ice caps. Now, why the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization were interested in this? Why the Naval Laboratory? Why not just NASA interested in remapping the moon? Well, we really don't know. We really don't know. But what we do know is that they fired a missile into the place. They fired a missile into a particular area that they wanted to fire a missile into, supposedly to find water, which they already knew was there. And we were supposed to be able to watch everything. Well, we couldn't watch anything. You couldn't really see anything. They fired it and a big dust cloud came up, which was rather odd. But we do know there's a big ice cap there. That's what we know to be true. And we know that the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization and the Naval Laboratories took an interest in the moon back in the 90s. We know that that someone fired a missile into the moon, and the reason they gave us was they were looking for water. Looking for water, which they already knew about. And so the name L-Cross kind of got on a lot of people's nerves, like what the hell are they really doing? What are they covering up for? And it goes back to Clementine. What were they really looking for then? And we don't really know. You know, it is all speculation. But what we do know, because it was measured by several different groups, and this is the interesting thing about the dust cloud they blew up. It blew up this huge dust cloud. Anytime you fire a projectile from outer space into a planet, you're gonna blow up. You're gonna put up a serious dust cloud. But the dust cloud they blew up was most unique because it was measured. The different elements of it were measured by several different groups. There was no way to hide it. There was no way to hide it. The actual makeup of the dust cloud, and it was just wild. All these different minerals that weren't even supposed to be present on the moon. But what was even crazier was the tons and tons of mercury blown up. This whole entire dust cloud, up to somewhere between 19 and 22% of the dust cloud was mercury. And this, of course, is known for a fact now. We know it for a scientific fact how many tons of mercury L-Cross blew up it blew up in this big dust cloud. And that, of course, started ringing bells, literally. Anytime you hear about a lot of mercury, it always rings a bell. Why is that? Well, let me talk about a current event, and let me go over to Norway right now. Right this minute in Norway, we have an interesting incident. There is a U-boat. Yeah, a German U-boat. A German, the Bootwaffe. It's U-boat precisely U-864. It's down in the waters of Norway. And what does this have to do with the moon? Well, we're going to get to that in a minute. But the Ministry of Fish and Coastal, her name is Helga Petersen, has stirred up a storm. She's going to raise the U-boat. They have to raise the U-boat, or they have to encase it in cement, which is pretty expensive as well. Why do they have to do this? Because the U-boat's cargo is leaking tons of mercury. You see, the Nazis were involved. The Germans were involved in a serious project. The project was labeled War Decisive. It's called the Glock, or the Bell. You see it on the Discovery Channel. You see it on the History Channel. I've told you what it does. I've sent you in a direction on what it does. It's a lot of speculation. All we know is the direction. All I can send you down is the direction on this stuff. But one thing we do know is that's what all the mercury was for. All the mercury was for this next generation physics they were experimenting on. Fascinating stuff. But anytime you hear about large amounts of mercury, it's always going to ring a bell. It doesn't matter whether it's on a U-boat, and there's been several U-boats that have had mercury on it. But right now, Helga Petersen has to make a decision, and they don't want to raise it because all the different German veteran organizations, all the different organizations, the different memorials,